Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Now
can
we
you see?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just
Is
let
it?
me know if you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, just let me see now. I just want to see, how do I go to the next slide from this now?
Okay, I can give you remote control okay. I gave you remote control, okay? You can just say next and I will go to the next slide.
Oh, okay. It would just try that now. If I say next.
Yes.
Okay, oh, that's great. Yeah, okay. I'll be saying next quite a bit because we may be switching backwards and forwards. So if you just bear with me.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much indeed to the organisers for allowing me to really introduce the Robert Chanay table. I'm essentially a physicist, chemist, who's really coming to the cell structure as a result of some 8 years of thinking about the role of the actual Robert Chanay table. So I think probably just the first part is to give you a brief overview of where the Robert Chanay table fits into a scientific study, some of the evidence that has proved its efficacy, and then we'll try and then move gently towards the end into biochemistry and the cell and all the pathways that the presenters have been talking about and will talk about in the rest of the conference. Yeah, if you press the next slide now.
Sure.
Okay, so essentially what has happened here is that I've inverted the periodic table. The classic periodic table is too narrow. It doesn't blend into biochemistry, nuclear synthesis, plasma physics, and so on. So by turning it upside down, now can I show on the, yeah, I can show on the arrow. Yeah, okay, yeah, I've got that now. If you see there, we've got 1 and 2, those are the representations of, this is the atomic number. So this is hydrogen, and then this is helium. And then we move up to element 3, 4, and then we go to 5 to 10 and so on. So that essentially it's listing all the conventional elements within the periodic table, but it's showing you how the energy levels are classified for the electron states. Now, in order to do that, you have to get 2 repeating patterns. So you can see here, there are 2 8s, the 2 8s, but also the consequence of this structure is that there are also 2 2s. And this means that you need 2 columns to show how the energy states generate all the other electron states as the nucleus, that is the proton, is increasing inside the structure of the nucleus. And so you come up to, for example, here, the lanthanides and the actinides. And I've just illustrated how, in theory, you could extend the periodic table, in this case, up to 292, though in principle, in recent articles, it's possible to have an infinite periodic table, but that's really using other mechanisms. I just want to mention that just briefly in passing. So that essentially here we have 2 columns of states to represent the actual elements that everybody's familiar with in the periodic table. Now, the other way is that you can extend the number of states if you choose negative states, that is negative n values, where in this case the electric field is repulsive. So this column and these columns down here, down this part, represent the situation where you've got protons or previously formed nuclei which have got positive charge, and so there is a negative electric field, and how the quantum states continue. And as you go further down here, you get more and more protons being fused together, and then you get that coupled with more neutrons, and in the end you get the strong force coming into play. These are at stages of 10 to the minus 15 and 10 to the minus 18 meters, so that you generate all the conventional protons, neutrons, but also you lead further on into the quarks, and really what is being researched into the multi-formation of quarks, first, second, and third generation. Now, the implication of the way this table is structured, in order to, the problem I had in the early years was, how do you where's the evidence for these two columns? Where does this come from? Because this seemed to be a necessary requirement to have these repeating patterns. So if you go to the next slide. No, sorry, that's the one here. Thank you. Now, the structure of the electrons follows a 2n squared formula. But one of the theoretical researchers at one of the conferences suggested that, in fact, it's broken down into two parts, which I've written in red here, the nn plus 1 and the nn minus 1. And the nn plus 1 represents the periodicity property, and the nn minus 1 represents the compactness. And so I've been able to show that these two terms are in fact successive terms in a general term. And with the periodicity, these represent the fusion of protons, and these represents the addition of neutrons by electron capture and various nuclear processes by which you can generate more and more neutrons. Now, one of the consequences of that is that we've been able to show how you get the magic numbers, the very, very stable numbers of protons and neutrons, which are both identical, the same numbers for protons and the same numbers for neutrons of magic numbers, but you get them completely independently. And so this arises from quantum field theory, in which the mathematics is based on U1, SU2, SU3 symmetry. And we start to get into the concepts of that particles are really combinations of waves, and that they only come together in certain blocks of states. And as they do that, there's like a general fuzziness. There's an uncertainty in the wave function, not only of the neutrons and protons, but also of the electrons that make up the condensed matter and make up the cells in the biology that you're all talking about. So I started to see that if quantum field theory has that idea of explaining the self-organization, it starts to question really the assumptions about overall thermodynamics, and it also really challenges the ideas that entropy always comes to more disorder, because surely in cell structures, it seems to me that you've got a classic case where in local situations, entropy is reversed. You get more and more order in the way in which the cells, the membranes, the molecules, they combine themselves. And then, as your two speakers have been talking about pain and been talking about cancers where things go wrong, there are so many pathways by which this can happen. So if you look at the next slide, I just think this is a fundamental, if you like, it's not a rethink, but it's looking at things from a more integrated, interdisciplinary viewpoint. it all started from the periodic table, but it's widened since then. And as you can see what I'm saying here, the periodic table must integrate into biological science, astroparticle physics, and cosmology. It cannot choose to incorporate parts of 20th century science, which reinforces and generalizes the periodic table, whilst ignoring or dismissing the implications of other 20th century and 21st century science that challenges some of the reasoning implicit in the table. So there exists in principle a form of the periodic table which will accommodate all internal and external aspects. Janet's idea of quantum states based on SPDF appears to be dismissed mainly because hydrogen and helium would be placed in the groups of alkali metals and alkali earth. And then, have you got the next slide? Observations from Jupiter confirm evidence of metallic hydrogen, and the positioning of helium in the Roberts-Janet table implies metallic helium is possible under suitable conditions, as both elements' electrons may become delocalized. In other groups, significant differences of physical states between elements does not prevent a group system emerging. So we've got nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, and sulfur. So why, in the cases of hydrogen and lithium, or helium and beryllium, is this not possible? So using the extension of negative quantum numbers, the Roberts-Janet table also implies quantized energy states in plasma linked with condensed matter. I just want to, if you just give me the next slide, I just want to show you the evidence of the, this has come from the results from NASA, where they've established that here, this central part of the core of Jupiter is metallic hydrogen, and these are sort of the raindrops where the liquid state, there's a transition states from the molecular hydrogen into the metallic hydrogen, and these are the transition states within the core itself, and that explains why Jupiter and possibly other of the planets have magnetic fields. Okay, if we can go back to further back, and again. Okay, that's all, thanks, thank you. So really, the idea of presenting this table is really to put it out to the community of biologists, cell biologists in general, that if we start now to look at the layer of, instead of now here, this range on the table, it's determined by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The scale here is roughly 10 to the minus 6. As we go down here, you go to 10 to the minus 18. So that, in other words, the interaction of the molecules and the formation of molecules by the chemical pathways, the biological pathways, are all of the order of 10 to the minus 8 to 10 to the minus 12. And we are now, as we get better and better experiments, as I presented this to many conferences in a range of disciplines, this is the first time I've ever presented it to a cell conference, but it's becoming quite clear that there are quantum confinement effects that are ongoing, particularly as you get towards 10 to the minus 10, 10 to the minus 12. And we are starting to isolate in all its complexity, but because in biochemistry, everything is so more complicated, as you're all illustrating so clearly by empirical evidence. And the table is trying to tell us that we can't specify the specific energy or the position because of the nature of Heisenberg's, and because essentially they're not particles, so that in fact we've got to now question in the back of our minds the idea of the chain and stick model that we describe how things fit together. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm not saying that for 1 minute, I'm simply saying that has helped us to get to where we are, and it helps to sort of classify the frameworks. But then when you look at the quantum level, when you start to think about all the subtle mechanisms that go on and how things can go wrong, as you've all been talking about so clearly this morning, we need to then start to think of the nature, so that electrons in themselves are no longer particles. They're this kind of, well, fuzziness wave, whatever you want to call it, and it can change. The point really is that self-assembly is becoming critical with this role of entropy and local reversal. Obviously here, when we're talking about cell structure, we are talking about very small changes in energies. So that has consequences. And one of the examples I've come across recently is vibronic mixing, where pathways can change. And the nearest analogy I'm trying to give is, now that you have started for hundreds of years to look at the biochemistry and those pathways in details, and you can structure and name all these different categories which are essential, and we can then start looking in more detail and starting to say, well, yeah, there are somewhere in the region of 100 million types of proteins. So we need artificial intelligence so that we can see how things are folded, how things evolve in that sort of detail. And then slowly, as I see it, using the ideas of quantum field theory as evidenced here by a simple, if you like, Roberts-Chanet nuclear periodic table. Once you've got the more fundamental understanding of these mechanisms, we may start to see how the mechanisms that your speakers have been talking about, how we understand it, so that the more we understand, the more we can actually process, and then we may then be able to tweak and change things experimentally, yeah, indeed, by radiotherapy. But the problem is, some of these changes themselves, as your previous speaker has been saying, they themselves cause other damages which are unforeseen consequences. And it's quite clearly a risk benefit balance between those things, as we're all familiar with COVID-19, you know, in the last 2 years or so. So the idea really from quantum field theory is that we start looking at decoherence, entanglement, the way in which it seems that the electrons, and even sometimes some of the crucial protons within the nucleus, because they're no longer particles and blocks of regions, though I appreciate that helps to get the structure, but in fact, things are fuzzy at the edge. And so sometimes a pathway changes, so that if you were talking about living things, we still don't really know the initiation of living organisms. And yet recent research suggests that within the membrane at fertilization, there are calcium ions, there are manganese ions and zinc ions which are triggered. There may well be others, and these seem to be stored in some way in the stacks in the membranes, which actually give cause to evolution. And then of course you then get mutation, so that you've got in the whole landscape, you've got asexuality, the whole range of evolutionary sexuality. You've got in parallel, you've got viruses and mutations living alongside the way in which the animals, reptiles, and so on, the whole biological evolution, plants and so on. And of course, bearing all this in mind, I know it's very theoretical, but of course plants have always known about quantum field theory because they use it every day. It's something called photosynthesis, and the energy efficiency of photosynthesis is almost 100%. And this again involves some mechanisms involving presumably superposition, entanglement, and decoherence, so that if we start to feed those ideas and concepts into where you start to see how the pathways are like, we may then be able to get a better understanding, but then we might be able to say, oh, so in that case, because we've got this background now, if we were to do such and such, then so and so may happen, and we can find these things out. So that it's a more theoretical approach, and it's very abstract at this stage because it's at its infancy. The best example I can try to give you is whatever city you live in the world, you have a traffic light system, and you may find that if you looked at junctions and over a period of time, as traffic increases, so the actual demand for rights of way within the traffic light system, just a single junction itself, that might change. So that sometimes you have to get the local authority to actually make more give way signs or turn right or turn left signs, because there's priority of traffic. As it increases, you want to avoid traffic jams. You want, in fact, to have a better flow in a slightly different direction. And it seems to me that boundary conditions as prescribed in the biological framework, that induces, by, I would guess, entanglement and superposition, that causes a change, so that if you have, as you've mentioned here already, the different concentrations of ions, as you alter those ions or you reduce them, then that has an implication effect, which then causes the cell or the structures to modify their behavior, and therefore to be able to adapt to the conditions, which seems to be the essential part of living objects. And I think that's the main point I wanted to make today. Thank you very much.